when Joshua, when we were discussing this amazing miracle where Joshua gives an instruction to the sun and the moon to halt in their tracks, and so that he would have more daylight to continue the war. And we raised the issue, what exactly happened here? And is this, how do we explain this miracle? Is it just, do we just say it's a miracle, or is there something else going on? And I started by mentioning the story of Galileo. Now, Galileo actually comes in after Copernicus, who was the one who actually first discovered that the earth was not flat, but that the earth was actually round, and that it was the sun did not move, but it was actually the earth that moved, and the earth moved around the sun and also revolved around its axis. And that is how, while it looks to us that the sun is rising and setting, and actually it's the earth that's moving, not the sun. So, and Galileo, of course, who I think he was the one who created a telescope and was able to prove that theory. He was branded a heretic because he said, basically what he said was, when Joshua says to the sun, stop in your tracks, he wasn't actually stopping the sun, he was stopping the earth. And that was considered heresy. And what we did talk about was the difference between what something might happen scientifically and as human beings would perceive it, and what the Bible is doing is speaking in a language of ordinary human beings and how it would be seen, regardless of what your scientific knowledge and understanding would be. And therefore, I am not at all concerned by what the church fathers were concerned with when they dealt with Galileo. And I'm assuming today the church doesn't get upset about this either. But the next question is, well, what exactly happened? Because did, you know, when you say, let's say we're talking about the earth stopping, can the earth stop? And if the earth would stop, wouldn't that be something that would then be seen or would have ramifications beyond just, you know, a longer daylight? And of course, this is a question that has come up over the centuries. What exactly happened and how do you explain it? And before I get to that broader question, I want to present three different interpretations of exactly what happened, how it worked out with the daylight hours, etc. And these three interpretations are presented in the Talmud. And I think it's an interesting exercise because it can help you also get a sense of what ancient Talmudic commentary is all about. And very often what it's doing is it's focusing on particular words, and as a result of these particular words, drawing interpretations that you may sometimes say, oh, that's interesting, or you may sometimes say far-fetched, but whatever, it is, I think, very interesting. So if you look at chapter 12, okay, no, excuse me, we're in chapter 10, verse 12 and verse 13. So in verse 12, he says to this, you know, to Joshua says that the sun should stand still in Gibeon and the moon in the Ayalon Valley. And then in verse 13, we learn that that's exactly what happened. And look at the last section of verse 13, okay? And the sun stood in the half of the sky. I'm not, you know, or at halftime, or at the half of the sky. I'm trying to translate this as literally as possible. And it did not move for a full day, okay? As a result of these two different kind of phraseologies, the Talmud became very, very specific and offers three different possibilities. The first one is that it takes the first part of that phrase, that the sun stood in the half of the sky, as saying it moved until half day. In other words, the sun, if we take the daylight part of a day, not the 24-hour part of the day, but the 12-hour part of the day, and of course this is average because some days have more daylight and some days have less daylight, but we're using 12 hours as, you know, just a simple way of looking at it, okay? So from sunrise till noon is 6 hours. From noon to sunset is another 6 hours, all right? So what it's saying is that it moved the 6 hours until it came to noontime, at which point it stood still, okay? And then after And then it says on the second part, it says, and then it didn't move until it set a full day. So at that, the interpretation of that is then it moved again another 6 hours, and just before sunset, it stopped again for 6 hours. According to this interpretation, an extra 12 hours were added to the day. So instead of having a 24-hour day, it was a 36-hour day. Okay, that's the first explanation. The second way of interpreting it is very, very similar. It basically says the same thing. It moved 6 hours and then it stopped. Okay, but it says it stopped for 12 hours at a time. Okay, and how does it get that? Because at the very end of verse 13, it says a full day. So it says each time it stopped for 12 hours. So you have an additional 48 hours, additional 24 hours of a day. And that brings you to a day that's essentially a 36-hour day with plus 12 hours at night, or a total of 48 hours. The third interpretation, again, they're all on the same idea, that the sun moved regular until midday, stopped for a certain period of time, moved until sunset, stopped for a certain period of time, which they get from it's all from this last half of verse 13. And the half of the day, meaning noon, and it didn't go to the sunset, okay, a full day. Taking those two things, but the third approach, again, 6 hours stop for 12, 6 hours start for 24. How do we get that? Because at the very end, it says a full day. And so this interpretation says that at the end of the last stopping, shall we say, was a full day. Full day translated not as 12 hours, but as 24 hours. And so the final interpretation said it was a 48-hour daylight plus 12 hours at night, okay, bringing us to 60 hours. So does any of this really make a whole big a difference to how you understand it? Not really. But I thought it was just very interesting to show it's a typical example of Talmudic interpretation, okay? And so that's why I just wanted to share it with you. But the greater question here, of course, is what happened to the solar system when this took place, okay? So on its most basic level, and it's, of course, probably the most well-known interpretation through the centuries, the Earth stopped. It was an enormous miracle. It happened. Did it have ramifications for the rest of the solar system? Who knows? Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. God can stop things. God can fix things. God can move things. He can do whatever he wants. And therefore, just take it at its most literal level. The Earth stopped, and there was this extra period of sunlight, whether extra 12 hours, extra 24 hours, or an extra 48 hours, who cares? It stopped. You had a long period of sunlight, a long period of daylight, during which Joshua could pursue the war. Okay, that's easy. But there are two other interpretations that I wanted to present, which I think are very interesting and absolutely worth considering. The first one is put forward by a very, very famous commentary called the Abarbanel. He lived in the 15th century. He actually was a victim of the expulsion from Spain. He was a very, very prominent Jew and actually served as the Minister of Finance to both the King of Portugal and the King of Spain. Okay, and he was actually the Minister of Finance to the King of Spain, to Ferdinand and Isabella, when the expulsion order took place in 1492, and he himself had to leave Spain at that time. Didn't have an easy life, but what I'm saying to you about all of this is a man who would have been extremely well versed, not only in the Bible, but in philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, whatever the knowledge or the science that was around at the time, he would have been very well versed in it. And he says that this was not a miracle of the solar system. He's saying the sun didn't stop and the moon didn't stop and the earth didn't stop. None of them stopped, okay? What he said was that it wasn't that the they had a longer sun, but that you had longer light. That the light of the sun, of course, this is adding a word in a sense. And in other words, it does what the scripture says in verse 13, the sun, stood still. And so what he's interpreting that is saying, not that the sun stood still, but the sunlight stood still. So essentially what he's saying is that this was a local miracle. The miracle was only in this area where the battle was taking place, and that instead of on earth and this place feeling the movement from light to dark and light to dark, the light of the sun kept going. The sun and the earth kept moving as they moved, but that God shone a light on this battlefield for however long it took. And it's very interesting because if you think about it, and this Abarbanel brings us as an example to bolster his interpretation, the plague of darkness in Egypt. That is clearly a local type of miracle, because it says in scripture that the nation of Israel had light. Only the Egyptians didn't have light. So clearly God didn't stop the sun during darkness hours and didn't let the sun rise for a week. Okay, no. What happened was there was this supernatural darkness, and it only descended not even locally geographically, but locally only where there were Egyptians. If 2 houses over there was Israelites, they had light. So he likens it to that kind of thing, not a change in the solar system, but a change in what light and darkness was being shown in that particular area at the time. I thought that was a very interesting interpretation. And the third interpretation was put forward also by a classic commentator by the name of Ralbag. And he said that, and this is actually a little bit more extreme, but again, an interesting interpretation. He said the sun and the moon didn't physically stand still, or the earth did not physically stand still. The miracle was that the Joshua and the army of Israel managed to defeat the enemy and complete this war so quickly that it seemed to them as if the sun had stood still. A battle that normally would have taken 48 hours took 12 hours. And so they accomplished in that 12-hour time what would normally have been accomplished in 2 days, that would have required the sun around. I found this fellow who does a lot of teaching on what he calls Jewish astronomy. I have no idea what Jewish astronomy is, but it is very interesting in this particular thing. And he just puts forward, what he does is he has a background in astronomy, and he just puts forth something. And Kim, maybe this is a good time to share this short little film that I find that he put out. Is that something you could do, or should I do it? Anyway, what he does, and I'll just give some of the background before Kim is able to show the film.
Yeah, I'm pulling it up now.
Oh, that's fine. Okay, what this is he says as follows. He says, first of all, he talks about Copernicus and Galileo, and then he goes to someone named Kepler in Galileo's time. And he was the one who first proved that the orbits of the planets around the sun are not circles but ellipses. Okay, and trust me, I don't understand any of this. I'm telling you stuff. I don't understand the physics of it. I don't understand the astronomy of it. But sometimes he somehow talks about that as being, by its definition, not an equal kind of movement. He also then talks about, and this is what this film is. He looks at the planet Mercury. Mercury is the planet that is closest to the sun, and that planet, I guess he gets this film is footage from, the way the telescope or something would see the sunrise from Mercury, and he's showing. Can we see that film now, Kim? This is you'll see the sun is setting, and this is a view of the sun setting from Mercury. Okay. It goes down, comes back up brighter again, and then it goes down again. And what he explains is that is actually, and that's all, we can stop the sharing now. But what he basically says is that this is an example of essentially the sun does stop, it does go opposite direction, and it goes in the other direction again. There is this phenomena in nature that the sun can stop, the sun can backtrack, and the sun can move. And indeed, the sun does move. Yes, the sun does not surround the earth surrounds the sun, but the sun is not stationary. And that is something that has also been discovered in more modern science. And so basically what he's saying is that, can he use this to explain in an astronomical way what happened here in Joshua 10? Not in detail, but he posits this idea that it's very possible that the sun could change its movement and not have these dramatic, crazy effects on the entire solar system. I thought it was interesting. So again, you do take that as you wish. Okay, now I'd like to move forward into actually the battle itself. We read parts of this last week, but I'd like to then kind of remind you all what's going on here. Starting in verse 15, what has happened so far? They have the 5 kings have attacked Gibeon. Joshua has rescued the people from Gibeon and defeated the 5 kings. But then he comes back and he starts chasing, and then he chases them south. Okay. And in verse 16, we learn that these 5 kings run to a town called Makkedah, which is southwest Israel, okay, and hide in a cave. So Joshua finds out that these 5 kings are hiding in the cave, and so he comes after them, and he ends up pulling them out of the cave and hanging them up. Okay, he's going to kill them, all these kings in the cave. Who are the 5 kings that are in the cave? The kings of Jerusalem, Hebron, Yarmut, Lachish, and Eglon. Okay, these are the 5 kings in the cave, and he pulls them out of the cave. He does some very interesting things. So if you look at verse 24, when he takes these kings, when they take the kings, take out the kings from the cave, bring them to Joshua. Joshua says to all of the people, says to the military people, etc., he says, put your feet on the necks of these kings. And that is what they do, okay? Which is a wonderful expression of shaming these people, and also saying, first of all, when you put something on your neck, we know this, for example, in Jeremiah. Jeremiah uses this, God says to Jeremiah, put the yoke on your neck, and he uses that as an expression of there will be a power over you. So you have this idea of putting something on the neck, biblically says, I'm on top of you. But when you put your feet on the neck, it is also a degrading symbol of that. Not just that I'm on top of you, but you are under my feet. You are not worth more than an ant or one of these, little things that I will squish with my feet. So there was definitely a very symbolic thing. And then he killed these 5 kings and he hangs them up. And we mentioned last week already about how he made sure to take down their bodies. So even though he was degrading them by putting his feet on the neck, there's a recognition here that these people are creations created in the image of God, and therefore they will not be shamed by being hung up overnight, but they will be taken down before them. Okay, and then he comes and he talks about that, starting in verse 25, that he conquered Makkedah and his king. He got rid of, and he did to the king of Makkedah the way they did in the king of Jericho. So here we know that the king of Jericho, we discussed that a bit last week, the king of Jericho and the king of Ai were hung, and therefore we know that also the king of Makkedah was hung. And it goes on, it talks about different cities. The bottom line of all of these is as follows. We have the 5 that are originally hung, that they find in the cave of Makkedah. Afterwards, we find that they hang the kings of Makkedah, Livana, and Devere. And in addition, we have mentioned other cities that are conquered: Lachish, Eglon, Hebron. Okay, now we know already that Lachish and Hebron and Eglon, the kings of those cities are amongst the ones that are in the cave. Okay, so he separately hung the kings and then conquered and destroyed those cities. Okay, but there's one city, and that is, or one, don't forget, these cities are not just cities, they're more like city states. Each city has its own king. Okay, so it's much more than just a city. And there's a different story when it comes to Gezer. If you look at verse, let's see, where am I? Verse, where is that?
38.
33? 33?
What are you saying, 33? Yes, perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, then we learned that Horam, who is the king of Gezer, he goes up to help Lachish. Okay, so remember, Lachish is, the king has already been hung, but Joshua is out there attacking Lachish to conquer it. Okay, and it says that Joshua attacked him and his nation without leaving a remnant. So we learn from here that the king of Gezer has been killed, and his nation meaning not all the individuals, but the army that came with the king of Gezer to help Lachish is also wiped out. Okay, what we don't hear is that the king of Gezer is hung, which is interesting, but I don't know if it is at all relevant. But what we don't know at all is there's no mention at all that the city of Gezer is destroyed, and indeed it is not destroyed. We know that there is evidence mentioned later on that this city of Gezer remains a Canaanite city all the way through to the days of Solomon. And in fact, there are archaeological excavations at Gezer. Many tourists like to visit there, and you can see the layers of civilization. This is a city. Gezer was not destroyed under Joshua. Why? I don't know. Perhaps he felt that if he had gotten rid of the king and the army, then they were harmless and could not disturb them. There's no answer that we know for this, but it is just something that is worth noting. Now, one of the questions that arises in this whole thing of the war, two questions that have arisen. One is, think about if the last few chapters that we discussed in general, starting with the war in Jericho. So we know that Joshua captured Jericho, he captured the Ai. Right after the conquest of the Ai, we have the nation of Israel going up north to stand between Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, entering into the covenant. Then they came back down, and then right now in these stories, then they have the treaty with the Gibeonites, okay, which is very important, which means this whole group of land, kind of just north of Jerusalem, that is already also in their power, in their dominion or whatever. And then this chapter, in chapter 10, we learn basically about everything south of Gibeon, Jerusalem, Hebron to the west as well. All that southern area is at this point completely taken in under, by the Israelites, and Joshua captures it all. So what we don't know and later on, and we're going to do this next week, in a very short, description, we learn about a similar coalition of the northern Canaanite kingdoms or tribes, and the fact that Joshua defeats them as well. What there is no mention of is how is it that the nation of Israel ended up getting up to Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal before the northern kings were defeated. In order to get up there from the area of Jericho or Gibeon or whatever that area is, you would have to go through actually where I live, my area, central Samaria, the tribe, what becomes the tribe of Ephraim. That's where you would have had to cross. And there's no mention of any kings or any wars or anything like that. So one of the theories, which I think is a very interesting one, is that it was an area that was largely unsettled. There were no cities there. And he brings two very interesting points. One is in where we will see later on in Joshua 17. There is, and this is something, by the way, that we did, and we have a number of virtual tours on our website. And the one that's talking about Karnei Shomron, I'm doing this together with Danny Ehrlich. It's on our website. In fact, when I send you the follow-up, I'll send you a link to this. Danny Ehrlich, who is our favorite tour guide, he teaches on this verse here in Joshua 17, where Joshua says to the people from Ephraim who come to him and complaining, there isn't enough place to settle in the territory you gave us. And he says to them, it's full of trees. Cut down the trees and you have a place to live. And and so basically, this idea says it was not settled, it was full of trees, and therefore it did not need to be conquered. It was not a threat. Another proof of this, I think, is even more interesting, going back to the story of Jacob in Genesis, where the brothers sell Joseph, and how easily Jacob is led to believe that Joseph has been attacked by a wild animal, because it was known that again, he would have been in that same area in what is today the tribe of Ephraim, or was then, became the tribe of Ephraim, where I live. Okay. And that this idea, these are both from someone named Professor Yehuda Elitzur, who is very well known. He's not alive anymore, but he was a very well-known Bible scholar, and that would bring a religious man who would bring in archaeology and history to help us better understand the Bible. And what he said was that that was evidence that going back even to Jacob's time, this was a largely unsettled area that was full of wild animals, because if there were cities, you would not have wild animals. Okay, so that was also very interesting. One last thing that I thought was very interesting, also Professor Yehuda Elitzur puts this forth as well. This chapter 10 goes into great detail on the capture of all these kings and cities in the south. On the other hand, when we talk about the capture of the northern area, it's exactly 15 verses. Okay, and if we include the whole southern area, starting with Jericho on south, we're talking about 5 chapters that are talking about how they ended up conquering this whole area. Compare 5 chapters to 15 verses, that's a huge difference. So why don't we get these detailed stories? So look at the nature of the stories that we have just reviewed, beginning with Jericho until today. Miracle after miracle after miracle after miracle. You have the miracle of Jericho and the AI and how that was fought and God's intervention and all that. And we have the Gibeonites, well, that's not so much miracle, but look at them. There were 2 huge miracles in this war in chapter 10. The stones that come down from the heavens, and then of course the major miracle of the sun and the moon standing still. And so this whole war here is, again, very important. The Bible is not a history book. The Bible is not here to teach us military strategies. The Bible is here to teach us about God's will and God's ways. It is a book of prophecy. Okay, and so therefore the importance of these southern military expeditions was the intervention of God, and how the miracles played such an important role in these victories. And therefore, this requires much more detail. There's also another thought that somebody put forward, which I think is very interesting. Not just that there were more miracles, but that perhaps the southern part of Israel, it has an extra degree of holiness than the northern part of Israel. And if you recall that what were 2 of the cities that were conquered that we read about in chapter 10, Jerusalem and Hebron. And we know even to this very day that when you talk about Jerusalem, you talk about Hebron, the first city, the city that was settled by our patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and becomes such a focal point when we talk about the original history in the land of Israel from the time of the patriarchs. Jerusalem becomes the eternal capital of the nation of Israel. Those 2 cities, they are here. It is chapter 10 that talks about how those 2 cities and the entire area are conquered. And so perhaps that is also a reason why it is given more attention. That's all for today. I hope you enjoyed. Any questions? Welcome to turn on your mics and share.
Excellent as always, Sondra.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so we will see you all next week, and we will begin with the Northern Kings in chapter 11. Okay,
Chapter
now I
11.
will tell you that from now until the end of the book of Joshua, we're going to go speedy, okay? Because there's a lot of stuff here that really, I mean, yes, you can read it. It's all battles and this and who they conquered and where they drove the lines and whatever. But we're not going to be spending as much time going into detail into parts of the chapters as we have until now. But there are some gems that we will be focusing on as we move towards the end. Okay?
כל הכבוד, סונדרה.
Thank
תודה
you.
רבה, תודה רבה.
Thank you. Oh, Ruchama, I didn't even see you.
Yes,
Hi,
very
Judy.
good.
Thank
very
you.
good.
Thank you, Pauline.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, Jim.
Bye.
Thank you,
God bless.
everybody.
I hope you enjoyed that video, and we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below as well as on the notification bell, and that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you, and have a wonderful day.